I'm Lorraine Bayard-DeVolo, the director of the Latin American Studies Center and also a professor of Women and Gender Studies. And I'm very happy to introduce Michele Leiby. She'll be speaking, as you can see, Bad Apples or Bad Leaders, Explaining State Repression and Sexual Violence in El Salvador. And so most generally, her work, as I'm sure she'll be describing it much more fully, but it's these kind of questions about sexualized violence in particular in the context of political violence more generally. And so questions about why do certain militaries commit sexual violence. Some militaries are famous for committing horrific crimes of sexual violence almost as a practice, but then there's other cases in which we find very little evidence of that, other types of militaries. And so she's mostly going to be focused upon state military violence. She's going to talk for maybe about 35, 40 minutes, and we'll have plenty of time for questions after that. I also wanted to thank Professor Katie Oliviero in Women and Gender Studies, because I know a number of the people in this audience are students from her class, so welcome. And I also want to thank Norland Library. This is, as I believe Michele is going to introduce, and we also have a panel on this tomorrow as well, and it's on our poster, Unearthing the El Salvador Human Rights Archive. We're going to be talking tomorrow at noon to 1:30 in the Women and Gender Studies Library about this archive upon which much of Michele's work is based, that is housed here at the University of Colorado. We have the biggest human rights archive for El Salvador. I don't know if it's anywhere, or at least outside of El Salvador. Bruce?
Largest academic.
Largest academic archive. And so it's just a very valuable collection, as I'm sure you'll see. And we're starting to think about ways of getting out the word that this archive is here, because we think it just reflects very well upon the university, that there is this focus upon human rights issues, and this is a place where people can come to study about it in relation to Latin America. So also thank you then to Norland's Library for allowing this to happen and setting up much of the talk today and the connections and the panel tomorrow. Michele Leiby.
Thank you. I want to start by just saying thank you all for having me back here after spending 10 months of my dissertation life at UC Boulder. It's very nice to come back, especially now that I live in the Midwest and haven't seen the sun in months. It is very nice to come back and see some familiar sights and some familiar faces. As Lorraine mentioned, my name is Michele Leiby. I am currently an assistant professor at the College of Wooster, and most of my research right now is focused on sexual violence, state-perpetrated sexual violence in Latin American civil conflicts. I'd be more than happy to talk about some other areas of my research on reparations or forms of transitional justice in the region, but the focus of my current work in today's talk will be on sexual violence. So I wanted to start by actually, for those who may not be familiar with the case, to just give a little bit of background on the Civil War in El Salvador. It has been over for quite some time. It began in 1978 and was formally concluded with the peace agreements in 1992. This is very much emblematic of the kind of proxy wars that we saw during the Cold War. It's very much a class-based conflict rooted in historical socioeconomic inequalities and also political exclusion or closure around the political system. So just to give you an idea of this sort of socioeconomic inequality that prompted the Civil War and the mobilization of what came to be known as the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. At the time of the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War, 3% of landowners in the country owned over 50% of arable land. El Salvador is already a very small country with very dense population that is based a lot in agricultural production. So this was a quite significant exemplar of the kinds of exclusion in the country. Before the onset of the Civil War, landless peasants grew from about 11% of the population to 51% of the population. Extreme poverty in rural regions in the country grew from 76%, or 76%, excuse me, of the rural population lived in poverty, and an additional, or 55% of that 76% lived in extreme poverty. So this is the sort of economic backdrop for the mobilization of the rebel groups. But what really precipitated the Civil War was the pretty systematic exclusion of the legal political opposition to taking power in government. This happened in consecutive elections in 1972, in 1974, and again in 1977. And this is what really galvanized a lot of that rural population to start to support not just the legal political opposition in the country, but actually the armed revolutionary groups in the country. So I'm not going to focus so much on who the FMLN is and what their ideological orientation is, because I'm actually not going to present any data on their own human rights abuses, which there are some, on a much smaller scale than what we'll see for the state. My own research does focus on state human rights abuses. This is in large part because in Latin America, it is, with the exception of Peru, the other country I study quite a bit, it is the state that commits the vast majority of all human rights violations during these armed conflicts. So I'm going to just briefly mention a little bit about the background of the state's counterinsurgency strategy, because I think it informs very much the kinds of patterns of political violence and sexual violence that we see. So some of you may know that the U.S. strongly supported successive military regimes and undemocratic regimes in El Salvador throughout the Civil War. And it was really without this military aid, particularly with the aerial support that the U.S. provided in the form of helicopters, really without this aid, the U.S. or the Salvador military, would not have been able to militarily defeat the FMLN. They, for a long time, were at a military stalemate. So that gives you an idea of just how strong this rebel group was. Now, the state's counterinsurgency policy really did use, either intentionally or unintentionally, did include quite a bit of repression, widespread repression. There's a seeming unwillingness or inability on the part of the state security apparatus to discriminate between who were active combatants in the FMLN and who were part of the very large civilian support system that were not active combatants, but rather part of the civilian population who might have had political sympathies with the FMLN. The state really did not take significant effort to try to discriminate between these populations. This is why we saw very large numbers of human rights violations, including in just the first 3 years of the Civil War. So sort of beginning officially around 79, 78, 79 to 1981, we're talking about more than 10,000 people being forcibly disappeared or extrajudicially executed. It wasn't until 1984 when the U.S. military, or excuse me, the U.S. government, particularly our then Vice President George H.W. Bush, who consistently applied or began to apply pressure to the Salvadoran military to rein in their human rights abuses or risk losing their military aid from the U.S. This was really the only shift that we see in the state's counterinsurgency policy. So around 1984, we see a significant reduction in the overall level of violence that's being perpetrated in the war, but at the same time, we see a significant uptick in arbitrary detentions and tortures and other forms of private violence that's a little bit easier to conceal than whole-scale massacres of communities. Okay, one often overlooked component of this repertoire of violence engaged in by the state is sexual violence, and that's going to be the focus of my talk today. In particular, I'm trying to document first the frequency with which these crimes occurred, because there really is no consensus on how frequent sexual violence was during the Civil War, but then also try to understand why sexual violence happens. So the two questions that inform my research are why state armed forces perpetrate sexual violence during war, and then related to this, whose motives or whose interests, are motivating these crimes, right? And this speaks to a debate that is happening in not only the academic literature but also in the policy literature between these two camps that have generally been talked or labeled individual opportunism and strategy. Right, so in the first camp here, the claim is that sexual violence is motivated by individual interests, right, not by group interests. So you have a privately motivated soldier, police officer, for whatever reason, maybe for sexual gratification, maybe for revenge, maybe for various reasons that we don't know, is individually, privately motivated to engage in this form of violence, okay? This is the proponent or the argument that is often proposed by state government officials themselves when faced with controversies over human rights abuses. We saw this, for example, in the aftermath of the Abu Ghraib scandal when the first photos began to come out of the prisoner abuse that was taking place in Iraq. One of the first official White House responses to this abuse was to label these participants, these perpetrators, as rogue soldiers, bad apples, right? So this is the bad apple side of my talk. The second side of this debate, however, and what we often hear coming out of human rights advocacy organizations, is this argument that no, sexual violence is not being perpetrated because individual agents are going off the grid and engaging in these human rights violations for their own reasons, but rather that this serves a strategic group level goal, right? Maybe that group goal is to perpetrate a genocide. Maybe that group goal is to terrorize a civilian population. Maybe that group goal or that military strategy is to interrogate prisoners and get information from them on the opposition, right? Whatever the case may be, this argument is suggesting that sexual violence is happening for strategic group level reasons. Okay, so this is the debate that I'm engaged in. The problem with this debate is that the two sides, both the government officials and human rights advocacy organizations, are claiming these arguments to be true, right? But not with empirical evidence. They're not substantiating, they're not systematically examining the degree to which we can empirically support one versus the other of these situations. And that's what my research is trying to do. Now, I should say that I firmly believe that this is not a question of either or, but rather degrees with which we see individually motivated sexual crimes and strategically motivated sexual crimes. I believe that there's probably going to be in any conflict some individual instances of both of these. So for me, it's really about trying to find where the bulk of the evidence lies, right? In a hope, of course, to understand the underlying motives of these crimes so that we can advocate for policies that will prevent them in future conflict. So the way I'm attacking this in today's talk is by looking at three specific implications of that bad apples argument. So this is the first of those, the first side of that debate that I just mentioned. So three specific implications that come out of this argument that, again, sexual violence is motivated at the individual level for private reasons. Three things have to be held true if this argument is to be substantiated. The first is that sexual violence will occur in areas where commanders, where leaders, have the least amount of information and oversight over their subordinate officers. Right? If we're claiming that these are rogue soldiers who are committing these crimes for whatever reason, and that the state or the commanders do not want these crimes to be occurring and cannot actively prescribe them from occurring, the assumption is that they don't know that they're happening. Right? So we have to see patterns of sexual violence occurring in places where, for example, when soldiers are deployed to the field, right, and they're geographically distanced from the command base, right, where their commander may be present, who may not know on a day-to-day basis every behavior, every action that his or her soldiers are engaged in. So I argue that sexual violence, if opportunistic, will occur more often in areas where leaders don't have good information on what their subordinates are doing. Secondly, I argue that if, again, this is not strategic, but rather individually motivated, we should not see a pattern of sexual violence only against those who are our political opponents, right? And I'll talk about what that means in the Salvadoran context, but of course, who our political opponents are is going to vary significantly from conflict to conflict. And then lastly, I argue that where opportunity is equal, all armed groups, or all units within a particular armed group, right, should be equally engaged in sexual violence. So again, if sexual violence is the result of individual motivations, of soldiers capitalizing on the chaos of war to pursue their own private interests for revenge or sexual gratification, if access is equal, if every soldier within a particular unit has the same level of access to engage in these illicit activities, we shouldn't see significant variations across members within that unit or across different units in the armed forces. Okay? Okay, so how do we actually empirically engage and try to understand which of these two scenarios are more likely or more common? This is not very easy. The first challenge really to examining state-level sexual violence is that we don't have good data on sexual violence. This is criminal behavior, right? There's no accurate self-reporting of armed groups' engagement in sexual violence. And the data on sexual violence in Latin America is particularly problematic, even more problematic than sexual violence data is in other conflict situations. So for example, we have lots of data, lots of testimony coming out from Rwanda, coming out from Bosnia, but the Latin American region tends to be neglected by academics who study sexual violence. One of the reasons for this is because a lot of the civil wars, with the exception of Colombia, a lot of the civil wars have now ended and have been ended or have concluded quite some time ago, right? In particular in El Salvador, the additional complication with getting data on sexual violence during this conflict is that the civil war in El Salvador began almost 2 decades before the international community even began to think about the gender dynamics of civil war. So human rights organizations, very well-intentioned, very progressive human rights organizations who were on the ground collecting testimony about what happened to people during the war, they were not asking questions about sexual violence. They were not even maybe asking questions about gender or even talking to maybe women. Okay, so the level of information that we have on this historic conflict is naturally limited by this factor, and it might limit what we will ever be able to know about sexual violence during this conflict. That said, I'll present to you the data that I do have. Okay. So what is the data that I have? Like Lorraine mentioned, the data that I'm using come from the archive here at Boulder. You should use it. It's fantastic. It's got a great source, presents some really interesting information on various forms of human rights violations, including sexual violence. The two human rights organizations that I'll be looking at are two legal aid, Christian-based legal aid organizations in El Salvador. They operated contemporaneously. What this means is that they were on the ground interviewing people, collecting their testimonies as the conflict was unfolding. And I'll talk about tomorrow in our panel discussion about how that presents unique challenges for scholars, right? The kind of data that I gathered from these testimonies, so what's included in the archive are, I should show you an example. I apologize, the photostat here is a little bit, but it's actually pretty accurate of the quality of the documents that you'll see. These are old documents that have sometimes been copied and copied again and maybe damaged a little bit in travel, so they're not always the easiest to work with. But this is an example of what you'll see in the archive, and what's represented here for those who don't speak Spanish is just an intake form that a human rights activist would use to interview a potential survivor or witness of violence. They would record demographic information on the victim. They would include a little narrative description of what happened, when did it happen, who saw what, who was there, do you know who the perpetrator was, do you know any of the defining characteristics of what the perpetrator was wearing? For example, were they wearing black boots, which might be emblematic of what the army would have worn at the time? And they'll fill in as much of this information as they can, okay? From these intake forms, about which I read approximately 8,000, there are more of them than that in the archive, so this is a very rich archive, but I read about 8,000 individual testimonies, and from those I collected data, demographic data on the victims of crimes, the perpetrators of those crimes, the type of violence, and here I included about 12 different forms of political violence, including massacres, battle-related deaths, detentions, kidnappings, forced recruitment into an armed organization, torture, and sexual violence, okay? I also included in some of the data that I think is most useful for social scientists to try to infer motive, to try to infer or understand the causes behind these crimes. I also included contextual details or contextual information on exactly where and exactly when and exactly in what context these crimes were perpetrated. And on this measure, because the Salvadoran archives were collected contemporaneously, because the data was collected at the time that the conflict was unfolding, these details are incredibly precise, far more precise than we see in, for example, Truth Commission data, which is usually collected after the Civil War ends. Okay, and by then people's memory starts to fade. I don't remember the exact time that I was grabbed off the street by someone, and I don't remember what he was wearing. Some of those details start to fade as time goes on. Okay, so what do the data show? From here we have, this is representing the different types of human rights violations that were recorded during the conflict or were recorded from the data set. And I can talk about the ways in which this may or may not be representative of the relative frequencies of these different human rights violations, because I do believe that some are perhaps overrepresented and maybe some, like massacres, are underrepresented in the data set for reasons that I can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. But from the data that I have, the most common forms of human rights violations during the Salvadoran Civil War were formal detentions. These are individuals who are being held in a state-run detention facility, whether it be a prison, a military base, an ad hoc military base that was established in a school in a rural community, something like that. But this is a formal process, okay? Versus kidnapping, wherein someone is taken but not held in any legally sanctioned detention facility. Maybe they're held in an abandoned house and interrogated in a very ad hoc way. Torture. Massacres, and massacres are killings of 5 or more civilians, so those who are not combatants, those who are not holding arms. Disappearances, and then you can see the tiny little sliver up there representing about 1.5% of all human rights violations in the data set are sexual violence. Included in this 1.5% of all sexual violence are these various forms of sexual violence that I collected data on. You can see that the most common form of sexual violence reported in these documents was sexual humiliation. This includes things like forcibly stripping detainees, forcing women to dance or strip for soldiers at military bases, things of that nature. Okay? Sexual torture, here's the one that's being cut off. These are, to distinguish from sexual mutilation, these are examples, and I hate to get particularly graphic, but this is the nature of the research that I do. These include things like electric shock or blunt force trauma to the genitals, but to distinguish from sexual mutilation, sexual torture doesn't include permanent dismemberment or removal of sexual organs. Okay, that's what I would label, and what I did label, sexual mutilation. And then we see sort of the case that we probably think of most often when we think about what wartime sexual violence is: rape and instances of gang rape, and of course gang rape here just being rape that is perpetrated by more than one agent. And then I also included this category of attempted or threatened acts of sexual violence, because even if they weren't carried out to fruition, I think understanding the context in which acts of sexual violence are attempted but not completed can help us to understand the underlying causes of these crimes. Okay. So one of the interesting things that I speak about quite a lot in my work in Latin America is the gender dynamics of sexual violence. The common assumption, not only amongst academics but also policymakers, is that this is really a crime that is reserved for women. And while the data here might be skewed, and I recognize that, trends throughout Latin America show that about 1/3 of all victims of sexual violence are men. Okay, and so the vast majority still definitely being women, but we're, by excluding certain categories of sexual violence, for example, sexual mutilation or sexual torture, we are neglecting to recognize the degree to which, or the frequency with which, men might be targeted for these crimes as well. So you can see in the Salvadoran case, men actually comprise the majority of sexual violence victims, which is probably a little bit misleading and probably an error in the data, because one of the kinds of sexual violence that we don't have good quantitative data on, but we do have good data from forensic anthropologists, from ethnographers, from anthropologists, is that one of the more common forms of sexual violence perpetrated during the conflict against women was mass rape, after which all the women in a community would be killed. And of course then, for these human rights organizations who might be collecting data, well, if all of the victims or the survivors, the victims in this case, are killed, we're not going to be capturing their stories. So those cases are probably missing here and skewing this result a little bit. But I do want to shine light on the fact that men, more frequently than we think, are targeted for sexual violence in conflict. But they're targeted in different ways. Actually, let me pause there. They're targeted in different ways. So women in El Salvador were more likely to be raped or to be sexually humiliated. Men in the conflict were much more likely to be sexually humiliated, particularly in the context of detention, to be sexually tortured during interrogations, or to be mutilated in these ways that I described. So to the degree to which academics and policymakers define sexual violence as just rape, we're missing a pretty big picture, or a pretty big part of the full spectrum of sexual violence that happens during conflict. Okay, a little bit more about who these individuals are. So what I've done here is examine the occupancy, and I'll show you in a minute here as well, political affiliations and memberships in social organizations that these victims reported. And I compare non-sexual forms of political violence, so this would be detention, kidnappings, murders, to sexual forms of violence, to see if there are any statistically significant differences. And those are the aspects that I'm going to focus on here. So we can see two things emerge here, that university students are far more likely, and this is a statistically significant difference. I could talk about the methods that I use to identify these differences in the Q&A if you're interested. But university students and professors are statistically more likely to be targeted for sexual violence than other forms of political violence. And they're more likely to be targeted for these crimes than those who are not students or university professors. So there seems to be a specific way in which these subsets of the population are treated when they're captured by security agents in El Salvador. We also see housewives figuring very prominently here. This makes sense given the gender dimension of sexual violence, given the relative frequency with which women are targeted for these crimes, relative to the frequency with which they're targeted for other forms of human rights abuse. It makes sense that we see an increase, a significant increase in the likelihood of being a victim of sexual violence if you're a housewife. With regard to political affiliations or social affiliations, a couple things pop here. One, I'd like to just say the fact that there are any statistically significant differences speaks to one of those first observable implications or hypotheses that I laid out. If this were a truly opportunistic crime that is not politically motivated, not geared towards advancing some political or military goal, then we should not see any significant differences in the treatment of particular subgroups in the population, right? We should see some kind of randomness in who is targeted or who is subjected to sexual violence. And that's not what we see. So these are individuals who are members of human rights organizations. This community is particularly at risk for experiencing sexual violence. One of the, actually the only other quantitatively oriented investigation on sexual violence that I know of that exists in El Salvador that actually speaks to this phenomenon here was done by 5 members of the Salvadoran Human Rights Commission who themselves were political prisoners, were accused of being subversives. They were picked up in the 80s by the state and held at Mariona, the men's political prison in San Salvador. And this, while they were there, while they were in captivity, they were in detention for a few years. While they were there, they carried out a study of the political prisoners housed at the prison. They interviewed over 480 men. This is only a men's prison. And they collected on toilet paper, on napkins, on scraps of paper, they collected the testimonies, the narratives of the experiences of torture that these men underwent. To emphasize why we maybe see this particular subgroup of human rights activists or members of human rights organizations being more often targeted for sexual violence than other groups, they found in their study of these 484 men that 76% of them experienced one or more forms of sexual violence. This is staggeringly higher than has ever been recognized in the literature before. Now, is it a representative sample? No. Are there potential ways in which it is not representative of the general population? Absolutely. But I think it does speak to the way in which particular subgroups in the population, in this case men and men who were human rights activists but also housed in this political detainee wing, were members of the legal opposition. These are individuals who belong to a legal political party other than Arena, other than the political party that was in power at the time. Also, again, figuring here university students who are not just university students, but active university students. Students who are participating in perhaps the communist organization of Salvadoran students, or a political group of that regard. And then the last group here these are self-reported in the testimonies, individuals who identify themselves as being members of the armed opposition, members of the FMLN. Okay, they too are at an increased risk when captured of being subjected to sexual violence over other people in the population. Okay. One of the last things that I want to mention here before, see how we're doing on time? We're okay. Before we open up for Q&A, is coming back again to this discussion or this assumption that I make, this hypothesis that I make, that if sexual violence is really opportunistic, we should see relative equal levels of participation in this violence when access is equal. Okay, so if you deploy a unit of the National Guard and a unit of the Army, and they each have equal access to the civilian population, and each are equally left to their own devices, right, not under the watchful eye of their commanding officers, then members of those two units should equally be engaged in sexual violence if it's being driven by private self-motivated reasons. Okay, and what we see actually is some significant variation here. So the Army figures fairly prominently in the perpetration of sexual violence. This actually makes sense, and the slide that I didn't save here, which I should have, which shows that the Army, given the frequency with which they engage in other forms of sexual violence, or excuse me, other forms of political violence, right? The Army is the single most frequent perpetrator of human rights violations during the Salvadoran Civil War. Given that propensity to engage in other forms of political violence, they're actually committing, although still frequent, less sexual violence than we would expect, given their size, right? This is also the largest coercive branch of the security apparatus in El Salvador. So given their size and given their proclivity to engage in detentions, torture, massacres, etc., they're actually committing less sexual violence than we would expect. The two groups that I want to highlight here that are really interesting, the Guardia Nacional, this is the National Guard. This is propped up to be the most elite, the most professional. They undergo some of the more rigorous training of all of the Salvadoran security groups. Actually engages in more sexual violence than any other member of the state armed forces. And more, much more, given their general reduced frequency with which they perpetrate other forms of human rights crimes. Okay, so this is not a group that is large in size. It's not a group that's at the front lines of battles with the FMLN. It's not a group that participates in large-scale massacres of the civilian population. So how do they figure more prominently in sexual violence here? Because this is a group of elite rapid reaction battalions whose primary goal was to detain suspected subversives, interrogate them, and disarm them, demobilize them, right? Given that, we see that the Guardia Nacional is perpetrating far more sexual violence in detention centers during interrogations against people that they've identified, maybe because they're a university student, maybe because they're somebody who belongs to a political party, a leftist political party. They're interrogating and subjecting to various forms of sexual violence in an effort to maybe gain information on rebel bases, on supplies of weapons, and things of that nature. The last group that I want to highlight here, and I can talk about the others if you have questions about who these units are and why I think maybe they did or did not engage in a lot of sexual violence. But the one that I think is really paradoxical is the paramilitaries. This is, by its fundamental nature, an illegal unit, right? A unit that operates in the shadows. It is created for the very purpose of operating outside of the military justice system, right? So by very definition, these are the guys that are given the most leeway to do whatever the hell they want, right? These are the death squads. These are the hit squads. They're not being supervised in the same way that we would expect an operating unit in the army or the police to be supervised. Given that, their relative infrequency of sexual violence perpetrated by paramilitaries is puzzling, right? If we subscribe to this understanding of opportunistic sexual violence being more likely to be permitted or to be perpetrated by soldiers or by agents when given leeway, when they're able to capitalize on the chaos of war, on the lack of information and oversight of their commanding officers, these are the guys that have the most of that leeway and yet figure least in the reported levels of sexual violence. And I should keep reiterating that. These are based on reports that I have, okay? All right. The last thing that I want to mention here, so how do I make sense of all of this data and how do I use it to go back to that original debate to try and draw some conclusions on what the motives of sexual violence were in the Salvadoran Civil War? Well, I should say that I have not published this research yet for good reason, because I don't have a good answer to this question yet. I'm still very much grappling with it and trying to supplement the data that I was able to get from the archives with in-depth interviews with human rights advocates, and also toying with the idea of doing a victim survey in El Salvador to try and get a little bit more information on what happened. But what I can say so far is that there is evidence of opportunistic sexual violence. Okay, there are clear cases of individual officers who are sort of exploiting their position of authority to do what they want, right? So for example, one very clear case there in the testimonies that I read, there's an incident where a police guard, a member of the police forces, he's on duty at night. He's the only officer on duty at night in this particular prison, and he's given the keys, obviously, to all the cells of the prisoners, right? He's in charge, and there's absolutely no oversight. And there are several testimonies from men and women who speak of this particular, name him by name, this particular officer using that position that he was in to engage in opportunistic forms of sexual violence, right? To rape young women, to abuse and torture men with no oversight by commanding officers and seemingly no other motive than his own gratuitous interest in violence. Okay, so there are some cases that seem quite clearly to be opportunistic. There are also attempts to hide sexual violence. So compared to other forms of political violence, massacres, detentions, kidnappings, sexual violence is statistically more likely to be perpetrated in private spaces. There seems to be an effort on the part of the perpetrating agents, even when they're engaged in a wholesale massacre of a community in a public plaza, to take their victims of sexual violence to an abandoned house, or to take them to the mountains, or to take them to to the woods, to some other secluded area where they will then engage in sexual violence. So there is this seeming interest to try to hide what they're doing. And this might be suggestive, of agents who are engaging in violence, knowing that it's illegal, knowing that their commanders would hold them accountable for these crimes. On the side of strategy, however, we don't see that sexual violence is more often perpetrated by units that have the least control. So I would argue that the paramilitary groups, the death squads operating in El Salvador, are given the most institutional leeway. And according to the data I have, they are the least likely to engage in sexual violence, despite their proclivity to assassinate at random, to torture, to kidnap, right? So these aren't good guys who just by their nature don't engage in human rights violations. They do, just not sexual violence, okay? There seems to be some evidence, and I think this is an area where some interviews and maybe a victim survey would help to shed some more light. There does seem to be some evidence of victims targeting. So the fact that you are not at equal odds, or you don't have an equal probability, an equal risk of being subjected to sexual violence if you're a member of the Salvadoran population, is suggestive that this is not pure random opportunistic violence. The fact that we see targeted patterns around individuals who are identified either by their own self-reporting as being members of the armed opposition, or members of groups that were labeled sympathetic to quote-unquote communist, terrorist organizations, to the rebel groups. So those, again, being the human rights organizations who themselves were very much under attack as being terrorists or sympathizing with the terrorists. University student groups being another subset of the population that are more at risk for sexual violence than others. The last thing I want to say about the strategic side, and I think what's actually the most damning evidence, is that the frequency with which sexual violence, despite these cases that I mentioned where sexual violence is being perpetrated in abandoned houses or in woods or in secluded areas like that, the other strong pattern that we see in the data that I didn't speak to yet is the frequency with which these occur in state-controlled and state-run institutions. Right? Where it becomes increasingly unreasonable to assume that no one knew or that they couldn't know that massive numbers of rape or massive numbers of sexual torture or sexual humiliation were being used against political detainees. Okay? So the frequency with which these crimes are perpetrated in military bases, in state prisons, in the police detention centers suggests that someone probably knew. Okay? The other piece that I layer on top of that, I actually look at how frequently a commanding officer is reported to be present during the commission of the crime. So this is one of those contextual variables that I mentioned earlier. 1 in 5 in 20% of the reported sexual violence cases, a commanding officer, this isn't a lieutenant, this isn't some sub-official, some low-ranking official, these are generals, these are colonels, these are captains. In 1 in 5 cases, according to the data that I have, in 20% of cases of sexual violence, there's a commanding officer present during the commission of the crime. Clearly, that is knowledge, right? And under current legal statutes, that's enough to prosecute them for criminal liability, right? Even if they didn't order their agent to participate or to engage in this violence, even if they themselves did not actively participate in it, the fact that they knew and then did not take subsequent steps to prevent or to stop this violence from happening, under the Rome statute today, is sufficient to prosecute them for war crimes. Okay, I'll stop there. I want to just preface the Q&A section by saying I'd be happy to talk about questions about methodology if you're interested in how to collect data, what are some of the limitations or strengths of the data that I have on both sexual violence but also other human rights crimes. I'd be more than happy to talk about some of the interesting obstacles that I found in documenting male sexual violence or sexual violence perpetrated against men and why I think that might be happening more often than is recognized by the human rights community or scholars. And I'd also be happy to talk about other Latin American civil wars. My research is, or the cases that I could speak most readily to would be Guatemala, Peru, and El Salvador. So I will open it up to you.
Could I ask you, that very last
sure.
one that you had there, that last slide, the fact that you had 1 in 5 of those cases, there was this officer present, that would really would speak to that. That can't be, obviously it can't be opportunistic if the officer, if the commander's present.
Right. Yeah, so those are cases that I would firmly put in the strategy camp. Now, it's still difficult to say why they engage. If it is serving some group function, what is that group function? What is the intent here? I have some suggestions for what I think is going on here, but I think I need more evidence and more data to really substantiate the two patterns that I see. One is sexual violence being used in mass-based community massacres and perpetrated in public to terrorize those who are forced to witness the perpetration of these crimes, to terrorize them in an effort to essentially warn them, don't do what this person did, or look what will happen to you. And then the other sort of strategic function that I think sexual violence serves in this conflict and in the others in Latin America that I've looked at is to punish political dissidents, to punish and demobilize them, and less to interrogate them. There is sexual violence that's happening in the commission during interrogation, but not as frequently as you would expect given the proclivity with which it happens in detention centers. So it's more often being used to just punish and demoralize and demobilize these political dissidents. Yeah, did that speak to your...
No, that's great.
Were the Guardian Nationale most readily identified by any articles of clothing, their uniforms, or how were they identified in the testimonials that you received?
That's a great question. So oftentimes, included in these intake forms will be because a lot of the people with which they're interviewing may be illiterate. So there'll be sort of a pictogram of articles of clothing that might have been common by particular units. So green and black camouflage and black lace-up boots versus a ski mask, which was very typical of paramilitaries, versus one of the paramilitary groups, one of the death squads called the White Hand, wore white oftentimes. So they would show pictures of insignia that were related with different institutions. And in some cases, the victim or the survivor or the witness couldn't identify, right? This is just a person in blue jeans in a pickup truck with no license plate grabbed me off the street, right? And there's absolutely no ability for them to identify. So it gets difficult. Yeah.
Well, I have 2 points on that, if I can. Where you got most of your data from the 8,000 things you're looking at, were those denuncios? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the victim could actually serve a purpose by being this is a denuncio, as opposed to I'm just randomly give you my survey. Like,
Yeah, no, these are active denunciations made by not just victims, but survivors or witnesses. Oftentimes, because this data is collected contemporaneously, and because of the nature of the violence in the Salvadoran Civil War, it's often a family member who gives the denunciation. And oftentimes, unfortunately, all the information that we have is, my husband never came home from work. I last saw him getting in his car and going to work, and I have no idea where he is. And then the human rights organization that collected this testimony would make claims to the local National Guard base, to the local Army base, the local police station, demanding information. And the really great thing, and I can talk about this tomorrow because I get really excited about the archives, the really great thing about what the archive offers is all of those communications that the human rights group made on behalf of the individual named in the testimony. So the letters that they wrote to the Supreme Court, the letters they wrote to the president, the letters they wrote to the local commander of the military base, which is great legal evidence then to again come back if we can then demonstrate, if we can then identify where this person was located and what happened to them. Having an official response from National Guard General so-and-so saying, no, he's not here, I've never heard of him, we have no record of him, is useful, admissible information in perhaps a pattern of willful neglect. Yeah.
and to the second part of that, we were talking about the difference between opportunism and the strategy. And to speak to the strategy side, I'm sure you're aware of the, I believe it was the University of Central America, where there were the 7 fathers, and then the housekeeper and her daughter were there, and they were raped, and everyone was assassinated. Is there something or some aspect of your research that could entail perhaps status, someone's status, and to the point of which they were, assassinated or raped, or and how that could factor in as a reasoning of why they were targeted? I mean, a lot of my Salvadorian friends, over the last decade, I've gone 5 times, and my Salvadorian friends still feel it's very fresh. They have brothers who never came home, that kind of thing, and they say to me, when we saw in the news, when we found out about so-and-so, and they took me to that university, and and they're Polaroids. I mean, they're Polaroids of these bodies and what has happened to them. And, you show that and you want to vomit. It's just awful. But the impact of those crimes, because of their people of status, the people look up to, I think that would be huge motivation and for the interest on strategy side. And obviously that goes into Oscar Romero and everything like that, although that's not sexual violence.
Yeah, I actually think that this is an area where the general academic community who are working on this topic need to give more attention, because where we often hit the wall is, okay, if it is strategic, why sexual violence? What is the added instrumental value of, and I hate to say it in those kinds of harsh words, but if we are thinking about strategic goals here, we have to think about, well, why would they take the added time, the added effort, it's clearly socially not acceptable, it's very illegitimate, it opens up their soldiers to risk of venereal disease, all kinds of things. Why do this if your goal is really to eradicate the country of communists and the communist threat? Why not kill them? Of course, I'm not advocating for this, but these are the kinds of questions we have to be able to answer if we're trying to really get at why sexual violence, what function does this serve in conflict? And I think one of the answers to that is because it is considered such an illegitimate form of violence, and because it is often targeted against members of a elite level class, often those university students, these are middle class, upper middle class, urban dwellers. The nuns, the U.S. Nuns case is another common one. 4 Dutch journalists is another common one who were subjected to sexual mutilation and their bodies were left on display. Why? Because that communicates a much stronger message than maybe disappearing an entire community of peasants does, right? And one of the interesting things about that, since you brought up this case, is that, and this again speaks to the difficulty of studying the Salvadoran conflict in particular with regard to sexual violence, is that the Truth Commission in El Salvador, while their records are not open and won't be open for I think another 30 years or so, they made a political decision that sexual violence was not a political crime. the commissioners made a decision that sexual violence was apolitical interpersonal violence. And they made this decision on the basis that there was no evidence of an order, no evidence of a high command order within the central government for this policy to be implemented. And one of the cases is that we have evidence on, that the Truth Commission itself had evidence and testimony on related to sexual violence was this case, and they still don't investigate it. They talk about the murders, but they don't talk about the sexual violence. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is the Salvadoran definition of rape?
That's a great question. It changes. And this is one of the things that methodologically makes, again, sexual violence very difficult to study. Even if you get data on it, then you have to figure out, well, what counts and what doesn't count, and what counts for them, not what counts for me, right? Because if we're using self-reported victim narratives and testimonies, I have to understand the social and cultural context within which they are likely to understand what happened to them. And in El Salvador, the legal definition of rape changed, I think, around 1992. I'd have to check on that. But up until that time, marital rape was not included in the criminal code. There were particular laws on the books that allowed perpetrators to evade criminal liability if they offered a proffer of marriage, even if they didn't end up marrying the victim. But if they offered a proffer of marriage, this was a way to avoid criminal prosecution for their crime. There are not legal understandings, but certainly very, very strong social understandings about who can even be raped. So, for example, I was speaking with Lorraine earlier about the difficulty of documenting sexual violence against men. Even the human rights organizations themselves, these are, very educated, very progressive human rights activists, often overlooked rape of men, because in the social and cultural context, which is heavily embedded or informed by understandings about masculinity and heterosexuality, men could not be raped. Right? This was not a viable or a possible form of victimization for them. Right? So it changes is the answer to the question, I guess. And I would advise anyone studying this to be very clear about what that historical and particular cultural context is, so that they can understand what crimes are likely to be reported and which are not. So men, when given their testimonies, very seldom use the word rape. In fact, women very seldom use the word rape, especially when you start to investigate sexual violence in indigenous communities throughout the region. But men very seldom use the word rape, and they very seldom use the word sexual at all. But when you actually read their testimony, what they were describing was sexual trauma, right? Sexual torture, sexual penetration, but they will not label it in a particular way, because to do that would be to say something about their sexuality and their masculinity. Yeah. Yeah.
So then would the flip side be that the perpetrators were also highly gendered? Maybe you wouldn't be as believed if a female was a perpetrator?
Yeah, are you asking to what degree the perpetrator profile is also gendered?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, that's a great question. There's some new literature on this that's being done, for example, in Sierra Leone, in Rwanda, even in Iraq, where we do have cases and evidence of clear victim or female participation and female leadership, if you would call it that, in the perpetration of sexual violence. In the cases, in the countries that I've studied, I have no cases of female perpetrators in the Salvadoran data, and only one in the more than 20,000 documented human rights abuses in Peru, the other case that I study. Is that to say that women did not engage in these crimes? I don't know. Certainly because I focus on state abuses, I think there's a reasonable assumption that they're not high rates of female perpetration, because for much of these conflicts, women weren't allowed to serve or weren't allowed to serve in combat. When you start looking at armed groups, non-state armed groups, for example, the Shining Path in Peru, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the FMLN in El Salvador, these groups incorporated women in fairly high degrees into their armed ranks. So then that opens up the possibility for them to perpetrate human rights violations, including sexual violence. But even in the Shining Path case, where they are very active perpetrators of of human rights violations, I don't have any confirmed testimonies that say that a female cadre perpetrated sexual violence. Yeah. Yeah.
You bring up masculinity and heterosexuality in it, and did you find any data of male victims, or actually male or female victims, because of their sexual orientation, as well as you talk about male and female sexual violence? Is there any, in terms of victims, is there any cases of trans, and where would you classify them?
Yeah. I have no cases of trans. Now, this could be because my data are all based on self-reporting, and it's still, even today, in both of these countries, very difficult for someone to self-identify, even if they live in the capital city, to self-identify as trans or even queer. In the latter case, in Peru, and this doesn't come from my testimony evidence, but secondary analysis that I did on the rebel groups in Peru. There were two rebel groups, the Shining Path, which I just spoke of, and then the MRTA. The MRTA was a Marxist-based insurgent organization that looked very much in some ways like the Sandinistas, like the FMLN. One of the interesting patterns of violence that was very well documented in the news, right, in the media, during the Civil War, was their deliberate attacks, not sexual violence, but homicides against gays, against the gay community, almost like a social cleansing program. So that there is very much obviously informed by the group's ideological program and their understanding of gender and sexual identity. So they didn't commit sexual violence against them, but did deliberately target them for eradication. Yeah.
Yeah, referring to the infrequency of sexual violence done by the paramilitary, could it be that there are forms of non-sexual violence that are more effective in gaining intel? And if so, does that support the possibility that the use of sexual violence could be to some extent opportunistic?
Okay, let me see if I'm understanding your question. Could it be that the low frequency of paramilitary perpetrated sexual violence is because they're engaged in quote-unquote more effective forms of political violence?
Non-sexual.
That would be non-sexual. Yeah, I think that is part of it. I think one part of the paramilitary, particularly in El Salvador, the death squad, they're called death squads for a particular reason. Not because they would go out and smack around civilians, but because they would shoot and assassinate them. I mean, that was their function. Is that evidence that sexual violence is opportunistic? I don't know if it's evidence that it's opportunistic, but it might tell me that I should caution the degree to which I interpret that as evidence that it's strategic. See what I'm saying? Yeah. So maybe I caution that conclusion. I don't think it's saying that it's opportunistic, though. Can you tell me why you think that might be?
I guess I wasn't necessarily saying is it evidence. I'm just saying is it possible that it could support that data? And yeah, I like what you said in that. Yeah, it makes you want to kind of be cautious in your conclusion. No, I think you answered my question. It was the nature of their crimes could be different and probably looked even less upon by the public than sexual violence. Yeah,
that could be. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you have. If there is the possibility of getting any information or from archives, the Freedom of Information Act, from the U.S. government, military, and even non-military agencies about human rights abuses as well, that might lead you to some information about that. And I tell you this because I know that I know from personal, I know that my wife's sister was kidnapped in Guatemala, and she found out that her sister was in fact dead because her boss had friends at USAID, and they were able to get information to confirm that. So there must be a memo somewhere.
Yes.
and exactly what happened, and we don't, was never found out, but there might be some way of, there might be an archive, some information that you could go through for that. Have you?
Yeah, there's actually great archives. So one of the ones that I have used extensively is the National Security Archive, housed at George Washington University. And they have a great Latin American collection. Fortunately, on the 2 countries that I focused on in my dissertation, so that was really useful. And in those collections, they basically have every government-to-government communication between the 2 countries for even beyond the parameters of the wars. So ambassador telegrams and things like that. They also have fantastic information, better information than I could get in the local governments in the country's own national military archives, of which they often won't allow a blonde, white American woman access. But the U.S. archives have some great information on the training of these officers. And one of the things that I'd like to explore more is the degree to which recruits themselves are subjected to sexual violence, as a lens through which we can understand how they come to view sexual violence as a effective demoralization tactic. The fact that their own training experience is very raced, it's very classed, it's very sexed, it's greatly informs their own practices.
One other thing is that some other research that I've done is that it's been here in Colorado, but it is not necessarily the case that sexual violence or even sexual activity towards men is really considered to be gay. It's just done and opportunistic, and especially if you have a group that just doesn't have access to, maybe they don't have access to women, and so this happens in Denver.
Yeah, this is one of the actually a common response that I get to my definition of sexual violence and my inclusion of why they think I see higher levels of male sexual violence than other people are recognizing. And a lot of people say, okay, well, is blunt force trauma to the genitals, is that sexual violence? Or do I just hit you there because I want to torture you and I happen to know that that's going to be an exceedingly painful way to do it? Is it informed by my wanting to attack your sexual identity or your gender identity, or informed by just my interest in torturing you in general? Or with sexual humiliation, right? Am I stripping you and forcing a detainee to remain naked for days on end because I know they'll be subjected to the elements, and that's a way to make them very uncomfortable and more pliable for interrogation? Or is it really informed as a sexual attack? I think that's a really hard question to answer, and I don't have a good answer to that question yet.
What does the memorialization in El Salvador look like as far as spaces or practices that are being done by El Salvadorians? And are the gender dynamics represented in those spaces, such as sexual violence? And is the representation of the state's involvement recognized within those spaces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'd love to hear from others who have been to El Salvador and work in El Salvador frequently. My experience, this is based on my anecdotal observation. I spent about 7 months there doing interviews and visiting memorial sites and things like that. My experience, especially juxtaposed to my experience in Peru, where there's a very vibrant, very large civil society segment that is still pressuring for reparations, pressuring for prosecutions, and successfully in some cases. My impression is that this is sadly not the case in El Salvador. Even academics, even members of the human rights community often didn't talk a lot about these crimes. They had moved on to other projects. This is particularly informed by their dependence on foreign assistance for these non-governmental organizations, and the fact that a lot of their assistance is coming from the U.S. Is placing more pressure on them to investigate things like drug violence and gang-related violence. So a lot of human rights organizations have kind of abandoned the project of post-conflict transitional justice and reparation. That being said, there are quite a number of memorials. There is some gendered representation or representation of the gender dynamics of the conflict in those memorials. For example, the ways in which women were massacred, but I've not seen any instance actually of a memorial site that speaks to sexual violence. But definitely there are many memorials that do represent the state's overall complicity or culpability and the human rights atrocities, but again, not specific to sexual violence.
May I speak to that for a
Yeah,
just a moment?
yeah.
I found in the, not the last time I was there, but the one before that, that in San Salvador itself, in the capital, there were a lot of churches that had their own private things that, because a lot of their leaders were targeted, a lot of religious leaders were targeted. And so there would be small memorials, but again, everything was documented really well. I mean, with pictures. Like, everyone had Polaroid pictures that they would be like, all right, you can look at this, and then we're going to put it away. And but very well documented in that way. But I also feel like the people kept their own memories in certain ways, and there's still a lot of feelings and sentiments around it. Like, you look at a bus, and of course buses are old school buses from the U.S. that are down there, and they use them for public transportation, and it'll have the Holy Trinity. But the Holy Trinity is Oscar Romero, Jesus, and Che Guevara. And it's but it's their own way of being like, we still believe this. Like, this is still important.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.